Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kuf Nun Tet. Today's stuff is sponsored by Rabbi Heshi and Ruki Billet in honor of the bar mitzvah of their grandson Elichai Iona Jacobson in Neve Daniel. May you continue to grow in Torah learning, midot tovot, chesed, and identification with Klal Yisrael. So proud of you. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started. Chodesh Tov to everyone and Shavua Tov. When I ended the daf on Friday, I just want to go back for a quick minute. We really have a very long daf, so I don't want to harp on it. The way I explained it is actually the correct way. It wasn't one thing I wasn't exactly sure of that I struggled to understand. That I just want to quickly go back just to kind of clarify. But we saw this case of at the bottom of Kufnun Zayin, Shevach Karka Oketza. We were trying to find a proof or to get an answer to our question. If you take out two loans and then money comes to you, right? Property comes into your hands, is that property more mishuabad to the first person, lien to the first person, or do they divide it equally? And then they brought this case where it was the complicated case with Shevach Karkaot, one person sold to somebody else, and then the person invested in that land, but they owed somebody money, and then that person came and seized the property. And the issue is that what was confusing to me is that while the buyer has the property in their possession and increased its value, right, invested in it, what they wanted to say here is that both the original Baal Chov, the creditor, and the person who purchased it, both of them have a claim, right? They're both owed money, so to speak, from the middle person. Even though right now, and that's what was confusing to me, but despite it's confusing, I think this is the case from what I read, is that the person who bought the land and invested in it has a shibud, in other words, is owed money, so to speak, by the person they purchased it from because they had achrayut. It was right, that if the land gets taken away from the buyer, well, the seller will compensate them for it. So that already means that there was some sort of a lien here. And that's why in the end, both of them are considered as if they have a lien on this property, even though the property right now is in their possession. So when the person, the Baal Chov, the creditor, takes the land away from the person and takes the shevach, the question is, how can they take all the shevach? Because both the land and the shevach are something that both sides have a lien on, both the purchaser and the one who loaned the money. So that's how I explained it. I just struggled a little bit to understand how could the person be in their possession and they have a lien on it. But what they really mean is that there's a lien because both of them were promised by the middle person that person commits, I'll pay back your loan and I'll pay you back if somebody takes it away. So that means that when they do take it away from the person, they can't get the whole thing because they both have possession of that sheva. Okay, that's in a nutshell. Okay, now we're going to go to the end of Kuf Nun Chet. As I warned you, we have a bit of a long daf to make up for yesterday's very short daf. Okay, and we're going to finish the chapter and really finish up all the issues of inheritance. Okay, and really, it's almost really finishing off the Masechet because the last chapter is going to be about documents, and it's really somewhat detached from the rest of the chapters. Okay, tov. So shalchumitam. We're at the bottom of Kuf Nun Chet because we started with this case that Gemara couldn't make any sense out of, where from Israel, they sent to Babylonia a psak din, like this is the ruling in a case like this. Ben shadava b'nechsei aviv, if a son borrowed property from the father, b'chayei aviv, in the time, meaning borrowed money and kind of guaranteed it with the father's property while the father was still alive, and then the son died, beno motzi miyav elekuchot. Okay, the son can take it away from the purchasers. This makes absolutely no sense, okay, but before we even get to that, what we do know is there's some sort of case, and then it's said about this case, Zoe shekasha b'dinei mamonot. This is like one of the most hardest things to understand, dinei mamonot, and they don't mean it's hard to figure out what the case is, even though it is going to be hard to figure out what the case is, but what they're saying is this law doesn't make any sense, meaning the logic behind the law doesn't make sense. Again, not the law doesn't make sense. The law in general doesn't make any sense, and we're going to have to say this isn't the law. But there's going to be some sort of law which the logic of it doesn't really make sense, the logic of the ruling. So first they ask two questions, why this makes no sense. Lava mai mafik, if the son borrowed, how can the son be collecting money from someone? They're the ones who borrowed. And number two, there were no purchasers here in the story. So what are we even talking about? What's he taking away from? What purchasers? So this makes no sense whatsoever. So now they're going to suggest, and there's a study guide for today, just on the first part of the daf, which is the first five. We're going to have 5 attempts to try to understand what this is. Now, it's a very strange sugya because the first 2 are going to be a little bit similar to the wording. The next 3, we're going to go off on a totally different topic, as if like they didn't even try to connect it with the words that appear here. Ben shalava, b'nechsei aviv, b'chei aviv, v'meit. Nothing to do with anyone dying. It has nothing to do with the son and the father. It has nothing to do with anything. I want to point out that some Rishonim, including the Rashbam, which is why our daf is long, didn't have that whole last section in their text, and some of the manuscripts don't have it. The last 3 cases don't even appear. So maybe, that's one way to explain it. The other way is to say that it was known that there was some sort of psak din that came from Israel, that there was some issues with it. They said, this really doesn't make sense. And they just suggested maybe it wasn't this one, maybe it was a different one. Okay. And they just say, right, once we have a problem with the language here, right, and the wording, they just throw it to the wind and say maybe it was something else entirely. And that's maybe one way to understand. Anyway, without too much about it, let's learn it. So the first attempt is to say, instead of ben shalava b'nechsei aviv, ben shemachar b'nechsei aviv, b'chei aviv v'meit. And here's our connection. It's a son who sells his inheritance before his father died. He sells his rights to his inheritance. So he basically says, someone, you're buying this. When I inherit it, it'll be yours when my father dies. And then what happened? Mate. But what happened? Instead of the father dying first, the son died first. And now it's going to be confusing because there's a son who's really the grandson. Okay, so it's going to be confusing who we're talking about. But so we have we're now going to call him the grandfather to make it easier. The grandfather's, right, the inheritance was supposed to go to the grandfather's son. And that son sold his inheritance to his rights to the grandfather's inheritance, but the son died first. So now what happens? The grandson inherits. Bino, who's now the grandson, not the son, the grandson, motzi miyad lekuchot. When the grandson now inherits his father's portion, well, it kind of skipped over the son. So if the son had inherited it, it would have gone right away to the purchasers. But since the grandson inherited, the grandson can demand it back from the people who purchased it and say, this doesn't go to you. And this is difficult. Why is it difficult? Okay, now with each of the 5 options, we're going to have to explain why is it difficult? And then we're going to reject it. And we're going to say that's actually not so difficult. So why is this difficult to explain? Well, they could say, your father sold it to us and you're taking it away from us. And we bought it fair and square. So, okay, your father died, but, right, we have rights to it. We purchased it. To which the Gemara says, no, umay kushya. Why is that difficult? It's not so difficult. Dilma matze amar. The grandson can say, what do you mean? It never went to my father. It went straight from grandfather to me. I inherited in my own right as a grandson. I didn't inherit because it went to my father and from there it went to me. I inherited directly from my grandfather. How do we know this? Tedan, his proof is, Dichtiv, Tachad avotecha yubanecha, tishitemu l'sarim b'chol haaretz. The beginning of this pasuk means, Tachad avotecha yubanecha. How do they take this to mean? In place of your father, your sons will take the place of their fathers. Meaning, the son functions like the father, and the son can inherit directly from the grandfather in the event that the father's dead. So, can't be that was so difficult because it's not so difficult to explain. It's very easy to explain. When a father dies before his own father and the grandchildren inherit, they don't inherit through the father. They inherit directly from the grandfather. And that's why this sale ended up not being a valid sale at all, and the sons can take it away. So that makes perfect sense. Well, I shouldn't say that because after we go through all 5 options and reject them all, we're going to go back and reinstate this first answer. But we'll wait. We have almost a whole amud till we get there. Okay, next. Option 2. Ben bechor shemachar chelik bechora b'chei aviv umei b'chei aviv. So now we're doing one more twist. Instead of saying a son who sold instead of a son who borrowed in his father's, but a son who sold. But what did he sell? His firstborn portion. Okay? Why is this going to be different? Well, we think it'll be different because if a grandson's going to inherit directly from the grandfather and ignore the father, if the father was a bechor, then we're going to assume what? This grandson is not going to inherit the double portion because he's not the Bechor. So that's where we're going to go with this. So again, the Ben Bechor, the oldest son, which again, we're talking 3 generations of people, so the middle generation, he sold his portion while his father was still alive, meaning when my father dies, I'm selling my firstborn portion. Apropos yesterday's parsha, selling your firstborn portion. Umeit b'chayaviv, and then died during the lifetime of his father. So he died first. But no motzimi ala lekuchot. So now the grandson can say, I get the firstborn portion. V'zohi shekasha b'dinei mamonot. Avua mezabin iyumapik, right? This doesn't make any sense. How could the father sell and the child, right? And the grandchild's going how could his own father sell it and the child is going to take it away from them? They bought it fair and square. V'chitim, and if you want to say, like we said in the previous, hachanami amar mikoch avua da'ava katina, the grandson could say, I'm getting the firstborn portion directly from my grandfather. It never went through my father. So therefore, the sale never went into effect. And that's why this isn't so difficult. That's a problem. Because if he's going to come on behalf of being a grandson, how does he get a double portion? It would have to be, to get the double portion, it would have to be the inheritance theoretically, right? It didn't really, but it went to the deceased, to his father. The father got the double portion. And then from there, it went to the son. And in this case, it doesn't because the son sold it already. The middle generation had sold it. But umay kushya, this isn't so difficult actually, because you could still say it goes directly to the grandson, and yet the grandson could still be liable. It would be supposed to get the double portion because now you might remember. Before even explaining it, I'll explain it with an example. If you remember, we learned about Benot Tzlafchad. Today's going to be a good review of a lot of things we learned. We learned that what happened. What did they inherit? They inherited their father's portion, and they inherited the grandfather's portion, Chefer, and they also inherited their father's portion that he was supposed to get from Chefer, the double portion. Remember? The chelak, the bechorah that Tzlafchad was supposed to get from his father. So even if you say it goes directly to the grandchildren have rights to the father's double portion. So you could say it goes directly grandson to grandchild, grandfather to grandchild, but it could still mean they get the bechorah because they're standing in place of their father. So, and in the case of Benot Tzlafchad, right, they were standing in place of Tzlafchad, their father, who should have gotten the double portion, but it doesn't mean it went through Chefer, who was dead already, to them. No, it went directly to them, from grandfather to grandchild, but they get it the same way their father would have gotten the double portion they get. So it doesn't really make sense how they could take it away from, this isn't kasher, because it makes perfect sense that they could take it away, because they could say the sale never went into effect because our father died first and never really inherited it all. Next, third option. Now, 3, 4, and 5 are totally different. These are the ones that veer entirely from the wording that we saw, and they're all going to relate to ratification of documents or verifying signatures. If there was a difficulty, right, this is what they didn't understand. By the way, I want you to notice the difference between the first one said itmar hachi itmar, and some people change it even there. If something was said, this is what was said. Kasha means if there was a difficulty with a case, it was a difficulty with this case, and that means again that's how I explained it before. It's not that they were trying to reread this into the case that was sent. No, there could have been a case sent, but this is a case that was sent from Israel that they had a lot of difficulty with and said Zoe shekasha b'dinei mamonot. So again, it's not like they're trying to reread the words here because they totally veer from it. So let's try this one. If someone's a thief, okay, all of these are going to have to do with someone who can't testify. But we're going to have an earlier stage where they could testify, and then they became disqualified. So in the first case, we have someone who wasn't a thief, signed a document. Okay, today's Rosh Chodesh Kislev. They signed a document Rosh Chodesh Kislev, and then in Nisan later on that year, they became a thief. Okay, they were convicted as a thief. From then on in, they can't testify in court. Now, what if this document from Rosh Chodesh Kislev comes to our attention after Nisan, and they want to ratify it? So one of the ways to ratify it is bring the witnesses to say, this is my signature. But we can't bring this witness because the witness is a thief, and his testimony is not admissible in court. So hu eno me'id al ktav yado. He can't testify about his own signature from Rosh Chodesh Kislev, but achirim me'idim, but other people can. Okay, other people can say, we know this was his signature and this is valid. So the Gemara says, why is this kasher? Again, we have to explain why would this be difficult. If this person is not believed, how can we believe other people saying that what this person signed is valid? Just because it was dated Rosh Chodesh Kislev? Maybe this person's a thief and a liar, starting from Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Maybe right after that they signed this document, but predated it Rosh Chodesh Kislev, and it's a total forgery. So why could we trust this document if the person who signed on it is someone who is not believed at all? Maybe they forged the document. So what if other people say this is his signature, and the date is earlier? The date could have been falsified. So how we allow other people to verify this document is hard to understand. Well, the Gemara again rejects this. My kusha, why is this difficult? Maybe this would only work in a case where it already had been before the court. Okay, there's a few different interpretations of what exactly happened, but it had already been before the court and maybe it wasn't yet ratified, or maybe the court stamped it already, but we're verifying that what we call the hempake, the stamp of the court. Maybe we're verifying the document where the court verified it. In other words, there was something that showed us from before that it was clearly done before this person became a thief. And then we're not worried about that element. And then we'll accept someone to verify the signature. Because as long as we know the date's correct, which we've resolved that by saying it was already established in the court, this document, even though it wasn't fully done, it's still missing something, but it was already clear that the date was earlier and we're not worried about that. And therefore we allow someone else to do it, which means it's not such a difficult law. So this doesn't work. Okay, option 4, variation on this. Maybe this is the difficulty. Someone signed on a document of sale and they had no connection to this land at all whatsoever. But then they became an heir to the property. Okay, how exactly? A little hard to understand. You could say through marriage, but that's going to be the next case. So it's not through marriage. It seems someone was next in line and they died, and then this person, became the heir. Okay, what happens is somehow they became what we call nogea be'edut. This particular document they signed affected them, but it didn't affect them in the earlier date. It only affected them later. And now we want to ratify the document. So the same thing. Well, now that this person is nogea be'edut, they're connected to this case. So we're not going to allow them to testify about their own signature. But other people can say it because they're not nogea b'davar and they can verify this person's signature. But again, the Gemara is going to say, and the words are missing here, but you can read it in the Bach, he adds it in, right? Same thing. If this person right now is nogea be'edut and we're trying to verify this document, who's to say they didn't forge the date, right? And claim it was an earlier date before they were in line to inherit this property. And therefore, it's the same problem as before. To which the Gemara says, no, it's not so difficult. My kushya, we'll give the same answer as we did previously. And it could be already they knew that the signature was signed before, and they were just trying to verify the hempeg or finish the verification process. But it was clear that the date wasn't a forgery, and that's why this is not so difficult. So moving on, option 5. Here comes the marriage one. So somebody signs on a document for somebody else and then becomes his son-in-law. Okay, so so now that they're related, right? He can't verify his own signature, but other people can. So right? And this is what's difficult. How could he not be believed and other people are believed? Maybe he forged the signature, right? And maybe he forged the date. And maybe the date was really once they were related. And how could we possibly verify this document? Now, here we're going to have a little bit of a problem with the previous one. And we're going to learn something very interesting about krovim. Okay, and the psul, the disqualification of krovim. There's a good lead-in to Sanhedrin, our next Masechet. Right, we always have that, where the end of Masechtot lead into the next one. If you're going to say maybe this was also huchzak yado bebeitin, right? The same answer we keep giving, that maybe it's not so difficult because maybe we know the date was earlier. You can't say that here because Rav Yosef Bar Menyumi Amar Rav Nachman Ava b'shaloch huchzak tav yado bebeitin. We are not going to accept, right? Sorry, this would work. Other people can verify it, even if we don't know the date was really valid. We don't have any sort of, right? This would work even if it never went to the court before. It wasn't already, in the ratification process or already ratified by the court. No, it can't be. And it's because we have this outside statement about this case that this is applicable, even if that didn't happen, then we can't explain it in that way and say it's not so complicated, it's not so difficult. So now we're back to saying this does seem difficult. But the Gemara is going to say, and here's where we get to the idea of krovim, and I'll just maybe preface it by saying, think about the difference between a thief and a relative. A thief can testify in any case, and this is a distinction we're going to talk a lot about in Sanhedrin. Thief is someone who's suspect that they lie in court about money, okay? Because they don't care to steal other people's money, so what do they care to lie under oath and make people pay money for other people? So they're not believed in court, any case. But a relative is just not believed to testify for their own relatives, but they are believed in other cases, right? Now, what do you assume? You assume the reason is because we're worried that they're going to lie in favor of their relatives. The problem with saying that is, well, then we would only not accept their testimony if they're testifying favorably about their relatives. What if they testify negatively about the relatives, that the relative owes money? We also don't accept it, right? Even though there seems to be a logic here, the logic is a little faulty. Because, okay, number one reason I mentioned, and the Gemara is going to give a different reason. So one reason, and I mentioned this in the name of one of the commentaries pointed this out, not myself, but that this issue of, what if they testify against the relative? If the whole thing is they're doing what's good for their relative, well, if they're doing what's bad, we should believe them, and that's not the case. So in any case, this all leads the Gemara to say, "Umay kushya dilma gzeira melechi." Maybe it's a decree of the king here being God. It's a decree of God that relatives aren't accepted. Usually they call it gzerat katuv, right? It's from the Torah, like it's just is what it is, and you can't try to come up with the logic for it. It's just gzerat melech to iulo meheman, and then it's just logic that he's not believed. Vachrine mehemne, and then, right? If that's the case, then other people should be believed. The la mishum de mishaker, and right, it's not because. In other words, it's not because they're lying, and then it's not so illogical. Now it makes perfect sense because we're saying, yes, a relative cannot, now that and especially if you're talking about a relative through marriage, but even if it's not a relative through marriage, if a relative can't testify, but they weren't related to begin with, we're not really worried it's a forged document. And that's why someone else could be believed. So this isn't actually a difficult law. We'll believe someone else because it's not actually that we're worried they're lying. So therefore, there's no concern that they change the date because they're not a dishonest person. And here's their big proof. If you don't say this, Moshe va'Aaron, okay, now you have to take out the word lechatanam. Some people don't have this girsa because it doesn't make so much sense. It makes much more sense if you just say Moshe and Aaron. Moshe va'Aaron, mishum delo mehemnehu. Moshe and Aaron can't testify for each other. Is anyone going to claim they can't be believed? Another reason why we assume this is gzerat hamelech. Sometimes you have real honest people who would never lie in a million years, and yet they can't testify for their own brother. So that proves it's just gzerat hamelech. In which case, right? So it must be el gzerat hamelech hu shelo ye'idu lehem. Moshe and Aaron can't testify for each other clearly because of gzerat hamelech. Hachinami, we'll say the same thing here. Gzerat hamelech hu shelo ye'id ktav yado lechotano, which means, right? That's why you can't testify about your own signature now that it's father-in-law, son-in-law relationship, but someone else can do it for you, and then it's not such a crazy law. So we've rejected all 5 possibilities because none of them, put it this way, each one had a logical explanation. So it doesn't make sense to say this was so kasher b'dinei mamonot. This is something we don't understand. So the Gemara is going to now go back to option 1. It must be the first one, which was a son who sells his father's property, his rights to his father's property for when he will inherit. What did we say, right? The son can say, you don't get that, the grandson, because I inherited it directly from my grandfather. And we skipped over that section, right? We skipped over the part where it went to the one who sold it to you. It never went into their property. And that's all based on this pasuk, tachad avotecha yubanecha, which we understand to mean that's a law. That means, okay, even though it's a pasuk from Tehillim, it's not meant to be a law, but it's basically saying from the grandfather directly to the grandchildren. To which they say, that was the whole reason why it's not actually so difficult. It's very logical. Well, that pasuk doesn't mean, it's not a legal pasuk. It's not meant for legal issues that the inheritance goes directly and passes over. No. When a grandson inherits from a grandfather because his father's dead, it's because it goes through the father. And that's why that law doesn't make sense. How can the son take it away from the people who the father sold it to? How can the grandson take it away when the son really did inherit it, so to speak, in the grave, right? It went through the son. What does tachad avotecha yubanecha mean, libracha? It means your family's traditions will continue through your children. Tachad avotecha, right, in place of your fathers, will be your children. They'll take the place of, right, they'll carry on the tradition. That's what it means. It doesn't mean legally, to which the Gemara is going to question, really? It doesn't mean legally? Let's look at, okay, now we're going to finally understand why this sugya is here. And really, it doesn't actually belong here. There's a lot of manuscript issues here, text problems. This really belongs in the Mishnah on Kuf Nun Zayin, right? Since then, we've had two other Mishnayot about the house falling on the person and his father, right? The first one was the house falling on the person and his father or the person and his heir. The second was the house falling on a person and his wife. And the third case was the house falling on the person and his mother, okay? This really belongs with the first Mishnah, okay? And that's why we're going to see right now. Could it really be bebracha? And it's not for law. It's not legally. This pasuk doesn't have any legal significance. Turning now to Amud Bet. The hatnan, it should be tnan, not tanya. It says in the Mishnah. Hatanya means it says in the Braita. Doesn't it say in the Mishnah, or right, the Mishnah we saw 2 dapim ago, Nafal habayit alav alaviv, alav al morishav, הייתה עליו כתובת אישה ובעל חוב, יורשי האב אומרים הבן מת ראשון ואחר כך מת האב, ובעל חוב אומר האב מת ראשון ואחר כך מת הבן. Okay, I read that pretty quickly. We learned it already, but I'll explain the whole Mishnah now again. House falls on a person and his father or a person and his heirs. And there was someone who was owed money, either because if the son died, he owed a ketubah, if he had a wife, or he had a creditor, and the son had no money in his account, no money to his name. But if the father died first, what would happen? He would inherit the father's money, and it would go from there to the Baal Chov. But if he died first, then he died with no money, and then the creditor would get nothing. And that's why we have this debate, who gets the money? And they said that, and they said that, okay? Now, and they have this argument, to which the Gemara says, now it's a little complicated, but there's a problem in the Mishnah, because the Mishnah gave 2 cases. One was the person and his father, or the person and his heirs. And then the Mishnah continued and said, the Yorshei Ha'av say, the father's heirs say. Now, that doesn't connect with the Morishav case. That just connects with the first case, where there was a father in the picture, okay? So the Gemara doesn't like that. And the Gemara thinks that Yorshei Ha'av maybe means something different than we thought. It's not, like there's a father and son here. And we assumed it meant the heirs of the father, because there's a father and a son in case 1. There's a father and his heirs, let's say his brothers in case 2. So when it said Yorshei Ha'av, it obviously wasn't referring to the second case, because there's 2 brothers, there's no father. But the Gemara wants to make that Mishnah work. And to make that Mishnah work, and that the Yorshei Ha'av refers to both cases, they're going to say the following. My lav Yorshei Ha'av b'nei, and we're going to get to a case of grandsons. When it says the Yorshei Ha'av, even though the Mishnah was talking about a person and his father, they're talking about the Yorshei Ha'av as the Yorshim of the second generation person, meaning his sons. Now, in that case, it could work with both cases. If the father had brothers, and then Morishav is Achei. So if the person, Alav Alaviv or Alav Al Morishav, the middle generation guy, he has brothers, and let's say his brothers have no sons, then there's Yorshei, there's the son of the person who died. Okay, now we have the son of the person who died versus the creditor. Or if it was the father who died and had no sons and only had, right, this son who also died, and his sons would be the heirs there. So in both cases, we can have it work that the Yorshei Ha'av really means, right? Again, meaning the Aviv in the beginning of the Mishnah is really grandfather. And the Av is the middle guy. Both the grandfather and the father died. And now we have the father's sons, okay? Meaning generation 3, the grandchild. So either he's claiming rights to the grandchild, right? In other words, both his grandfather died or his uncle died and his own father. And either way, he's going to inherit. And the issue is just, who did he inherit from first? If he inherited from his father first, because the father died, the father had no money in his account. If the brother died or the grandfather died first, then the middle person, right, their father inherited first, and then the creditor would be able to get the money. So if you do that, now, this only works if you don't hold tachat avotecha yubanecha, because now we're going to skip the Morishav case. If we talk about the grandfather case, then if you can't say, I'm coming from my grandfather, then the right? Because when it says it's not a legal thing, yet it always goes through the father. Then think about this case. It went grandfather, father, grandson. Or, right? And this, whether the son, the middle generation, died first or second, it doesn't matter. It'll go through him anyway. Because when the grandson inherits, it goes through the father. If we say tachat avotecha yubanecha, inherit directly, doesn't come to say anything legal. It's just saying your children continue, right, your whole tradition, and it's a blessing. If the son died first, and then the father, if the middle one died first, and then his father died, my have still the creditor could say, listen, it's true your father died first. Even if he died first, it doesn't matter. When it went from the grandfather to you, it stopped in the middle through the middle guy. And if it went to the father first, then we get to demand our money. So it shouldn't matter the order, and then there'd be no argument here. It would be 100% the Baal Chov gets the money. So that proves that it must be Ledina also, which then rejects our previous section, which we said was our answer. But now they're going to say, no, you don't have to understand the Mishnah that way. You could understand that your Ha'av are Echav and Morishav are Achei De'avuha. Okay, let's explain. Your Ha'av is probably what we thought before. The heirs of the grandfather, which there is no grandfather here because it's just a father and son. Going back to what it was before, there's no grandfather, there's no grandson we're talking about here. What happened? There's the brothers of the father. They're the ones who are going to inherit. Either they're going to inherit the father because the father died, right? Or they're going to inherit even if the son died second, it went from the father to the son, and from the son had no heirs, so it went to the uncle. Okay, and and that's the Yorshei Ha'av. I'm sorry, I didn't say it right. The Yorshei Ha'av are his brothers. And that's, if he died first, then the father's property all went to his other brothers. And if he died second, then, right, he got his portion, but then his brothers anyways inherit him, right? So that would be a case for the Echav, and the Morishav would be Achei De'avua. The Morishav are the father's brothers, and that would be, right then, the Yorshei Ha'av means the father's brothers. So we can explain the Mishnah having nothing to do with grandfather's grandchildren, in which case it doesn't pose a problem to the previous section, which means that, again, if we want to summarize, at least get to back to the bottom line of the last sugya, we had this one case that was sent from Israel that we said we don't understand what this law is. In the end, after trying 5 different options, we went back to explaining option 1. It's a son who inherits his father's property. I'm sorry, son who sells his father's inheritance, what he's supposed to get. And then if he dies, though, before the father dies, it goes straight to the grandchild, and that's why the grandchild can take it away, but it doesn't really go straight to the grandchild, and that doesn't really make sense. The law is telling you it skips, right, that the son has the rights to say, you didn't buy anything, but it doesn't really make sense because really the inheritance does go through the son to the grandson. And it doesn't make sense why we would say this because tachat avotecha yubanecha is not a legal thing. It's just a blessing. And therefore, it's a very hard halacha to understand. It's still a true halacha, but it's very hard to understand. Okay, that was a complicated section to get to kind of a simple explanation in the end. Ba'amine merav sheshet. Now we're going to a different topic, which why is this here? Well, number one, it's a little similar to what we were just discussing, and perhaps that explains why some people put the sugya here, the previous sugya here, even though it really belongs on the Mishnah Kuf Nun Zayin. This will relate to the Mishnah on Kuf Nun Chet from yesterday's daf. Okay, the case of the last Mishnah we just had, which was Nafal Alava Alimo. Okay, and that's why this section is definitely here. And okay, let's see. We're now going to have a question they asked Rav Sheshet. It actually relates to a halacha we've seen already. So part of this is review. And then we're going to bring two proofs, one from a Braita that's a little bit more complicated. Then we're going to prove it much more simply from our Mishnah. So Baal Minei Rav Sheshet. They asked Rav Sheshet the following question. Ben ma'u she'ira shetimo bekever la'anchil la'achiv min ha'av. It's a little bit complicated, but not so complicated now. If a son, now we have to say the mother had no children other than this one son. And the son, though, had brothers from his father from a previous marriage or from a different marriage. So if the son dies and then the mother dies, now the son's supposed to inherit from the mother, but if the son's already dead, perhaps the mother's property goes back to her family. Or does it go through the deceased son, even though he's dead already? And from there, it'll go to the son's brothers, okay, who are not even related to this woman. But perhaps does he inherit in the grave? Because if he was alive, what would happen? He would inherit his mother when his mother died. And from there, if he dies and doesn't have children, it'll go to his brothers. So the question is, if it happened, but he died first, he predeceases the mother, maybe it goes to him anyway. Now, this is similar to what we talked about. When it goes from the father to the grandson, it goes through, right? When it goes from the grandfather to the grandson, it goes through the father, even though he's dead. So would the same thing happen here? Now, it's different here because theoretically her heirs, right, or her family, which is not the same family at all, at least the grandfather and the son, at least we're passing it all on within the same family. Here it would be a different family. So Amar lahu Rav Sheshet, Tanitua. He says, let's learn it from here. First, they're going to say, we're going to learn it from this case. And then they say, no, it's definitely not learned from that case. That case doesn't mean anything. It's kind of like we started today's daf, where there's obviously a mistake here. And we're going to, again, we keep touching all year on topics having to do with hostages and people dying in captivity. So ha'av shenishba umeit beno b'medina. So we have a father who was taken captive and was killed. And the son is in town with us. And we obviously don't know when the father was killed in captivity. So we don't know who died first. Uben shenishba umeit aviv b'medina. The reverse. The son is the one taken captive and the father is the one who dies here. Yorsheh Avi, Yorsheh Ben Yachloku. So each one fights about who died first. To which the Gemara says, hey, Chidami, what's the case? If it's just like it says in this Braita, hey, Ninu Yorsheh Avi, hey, Ninu Yorsheh Ben. They're the same. The father's heirs and the son heirs, they're all the same, really, right? They're all the same family and they would inherit the same stuff. So it can't possibly be. It's all the same people. Like, let's say, guy has no kids, so it would be, right, his brothers, and his brothers also would inherit his father, or his sons would also inherit from his father and from him. So there's no, right, when we had the question, it was, there's creditors, right? And the guy had no money, but in this case, it's all one and the same. So it must be, alalav haki kamar, av shenishba umeit ben bito b'medina. We're going to have people related, it's going to be a grandfather through the maternal grandfather and the grandchild. Okay, so again, we're going to have both possibilities. Either the grandfather was taken captive and his grandson was killed in the Medina, in the city, or Ben, and most people take out the word bito, the Bach takes it out, we're going to read it. Uben shenishba, the son gets taken captive and killed there. Umeit avi imo b'Medina, and his maternal grandfather dies in the Medina. So it's the same case, it's just who died in captivity, who died here, which doesn't make any bit of a difference. Either which way, it's the same thing. Below yadan and hemi nayomeit bereisha. We don't know who died first. Yorsheh avi Yorsheh ben yachloku. So now, the father's heirs, meaning the father of the mother, okay, meaning the grandfather, who has heirs, right, his sons who are not, right, the grandson's heirs, the Yorsheh Ben are his brothers from a different marriage. Now you'd have to explain the cases. She's the only daughter, right? It's the maternal grandfather. Now she's the only daughter, so she's supposed to inherit. And the question is, right now, in Ita, if we say that she could inherit, that the son can inherit his mother in the grave, then Yehinami de Ben Meit Bereisha, even if the son dies first, Lirte lavua diime bekivre. The grandfather, the maternal grandfather's possessions should go to the daughter, from the daughter to the son, even though he's dead, if we say it works. And then no matter what, that son's brothers from a different, or his father from a different marriage will inherit him. And the father's family will never get anything. And his brothers from his father will get it. And since it doesn't say that, and it says there's an argument, shows that the son does not inherit in the grave. Okay, it must be he doesn't. And that's why there's a debate between who died first. If the grandfather died first, then his heirs would get it. Right? And it wouldn't go through the mother to the son because the son's dead. Okay? Because if it would, then, right? And if the grandfather died first, then the mother passes on her inheritance to her child, which will then go to the other children. Okay? But it wouldn't be a question at all if he doesn't inherit in the grave. So that was a more complicated proof. The next proof is simpler. And in fact, Tosfot asked, why didn't Rav Sheshet just bring this proof? Because this is brought by somebody else. It's in our Mishnah. Now, this is the same basic case. It's just a little simpler, which is he and the mother die at the exact same time, right? There was a little more complicated. It was the grandfather from the mother's side dying. We don't know who died first. Here we have him and the mother dying at around the same time. We don't know who died first. There's her father's family who's claiming rights, and there's his family. Now, again, this is very simple. If we say yachloku, they split it 50-50 because we don't know who should inherit, right? We don't know which one died first. It would matter if the son inherits even when he's dead. So if he died first, that's exactly the case they asked about. Again, he should inherit in the grave, and his heirs should get everything, and it should not be a debate. So, it must be that this isn't the case. The son does not inherit the mother once he's dead. Okay, the mother's inheritance goes to the son only in the event that the son is still alive. If she has no children, it's going to revert back to her family. And in fact, you might remember this. Tamamai, what's the reason for this? It's a Gzera Shava we learned from the Psukim. Amar Abaye, Ne'emra siba beben v'ne'emra siba bebal. Okay, like I said, we're a good review of a bunch of things we saw. If you remember these psukim, lotisov, this was all given to the first generation of people going into the land. They can't marry out of the tribe because if the women marry out of the tribe, if they're the only girls in their family and they're going to inherit, they can't marry out of the tribe because it will put nachala into someone else's territory, right? Their nachala from their tribe will end up they'll be inherited either by their husband or by their child. So because one pasuk talks about lo tisav nachalami matel mateh, and the other one says velo tisav nachalami matel mateh achel, and they're both kind of saying the same thing, but they learn one must be going if it goes to her husband, and the other is if it goes to her son. Like let's say her husband's not alive, but still her son will inherit. From there, we learned all these laws that the son inherits and the husband inherits. But once we have this Gzera Shava, we say the following: Mas sibaha murabit. That's what's true for one is going to be true for the other. Mas sibaha murabit bal ein abal yoresh tishto bekever. Af sibaha murabit ben ein ben yoresh timo bekever lanchil achim min ha'av. So the husband doesn't inherit his wife if he's dead. Why is that? I'm sorry, when she's dead. When she's dead and her father now dies, let's say she's the only daughter, or one of daughters, she should get the father's territory. And theoretically, even though she's dead, maybe it would go to her husband. No. Husband inherits whatever the wife has at the time she dies. He doesn't inherit things she inherits later that she theoretically would have inherited later. So if the father dies and the daughter's dead already, it all goes to the father's family. So just like it works like that way, and just last time we taught this, and since it's late, I'm not going to go through this again. The bekever is used differently here. Okay? Einabal Yeresh Dishto bekever is when the woman's in the grave, when she dies first. And the Afsiba Murab Ben Einaben Yeresh Dimo when the son is in the kever. Okay, so if the son is in the grave, he won't inherit the stuff from his mother to pass on to his paternal brothers. Okay, and that's just what we saw before. So that's just the reason. It comes from Gzera Shava. Now we're going to end with a section that really seemingly doesn't belong here. It seems to be here, number one, because it is an issue of two people fighting over money, like Yoshea Av, Yoshea Ben, or whatever cases we saw today, Baal Chov, this. two people fighting over money, but it has nothing to do with inheritance. It has to do with sales. And it sounds a lot more like even the beginning of Bava Metzia when we started with two people fighting over money, like a talit. And it's going to return to sugyot we saw in the third chapter of Chezkat Habatim. And it's almost like this is an end to the Masechet, even though, like I said, we're going to start a new parak tomorrow. But it's a bit of a side chapter, not exactly part of the. So it's a sort of summary of everything we've been seeing, or a sum up of at least a very central section. So somebody said to his friend, Nichse debar sisin mizavnin alach. I'm selling you all the property I bought from bar sisin. But he didn't exactly say it in those words, but that's kind of what he meant. He had a piece of land that was called the land of Bar Sisin, maybe his many, many generations ago or something. But Amar Le, I love the Bar Sisin. This land isn't what I was referring to, because that's not what I bought from that guy. It just happens to be called that, but I didn't include that in the sale. So Rav Nachman said, look, it's called Bei Bar Sisin. It belongs to the buyer. He bought all the land of Bei Bar Sisin. It's there. Amalei Rav Nachman. Dina Hachi? Rav says, what are you talking about? The land is in the possession of the seller until the buyer can prove otherwise. It stays with the seller. Now we're going to say, but their psak seems to contradict what they say elsewhere. Rami de Rav Nachman. Seems a total contradiction of what they say in a different case. What are you doing in my house? What do you mean? I've been in your house for 3 years and I've been eating the property. I've been taking the proceeds for 3 years. Okay, some people say this means I live far away and I didn't know. Some people say it means I was living in the inner house and every day I walked through and I was showing that I was protesting. What do you mean? Rav Nachman, it came before Rav Nachman, the one who claims, not the original owner, and that's in the original case, Rav Nachman said the original owner gets to keep it, right? He said, he says it goes to the hands of the seller. Sorry, my mistake. Goes to the hands of the seller in the previous case. In this case, he said, the one who claims it now doesn't get it. You have to prove that you were living there, shnei chazaka. Until you can prove that, you don't get anything. Amalei Rav Nachman Dina Hachi Matzima Chavero Alav Haraya. Rav says, what are you talking about? Matzima Chavero Alav Haraya. It stays in the hands of the one who's muchzak, which is the opposite of what he's. Well, it's not exactly the opposite. He also said Matzima Chavero Alav Haraya in the previous, and that's how we're going to explain it. But he said last time it goes right. He says it stays in the hands of the seller, the original owner, and here he's giving it to the second guy. So kasha derava Nachman, to which the Gemara answers derava lo kasha hacha mocher kai b'nichsei hatam lokech kai b'nichsei. Rav is very simple. In each case, it's a different person who's muchzak. He always sides with whoever has possession. In the first case, it's the seller because it didn't yet pass over hands. In the second case, it's the person living there. Very easy. Ending with this now, Rav Nachman lo kasha hacha kevan de amarle Bei Bar Sisin umikri de Bei Bar Sisin alei didei Rama legilui de lav Bei Bar Sisini. The logic is on the side of the person who bought it, because the person bought all the land of Bei Bar Sisin. This is called Bei Bar Sisin. It says until proven otherwise. But in the other case, the person who says, I've been living here for 3 years, is no different than someone who says, I have a star that I bought this. Now, if you brought a star to court that said, I bought this, what would you need to do? Wouldn't we say to you, go prove that your star is a valid star? So, therefore, same thing with the guy who's muchzak. As long as you can prove you've been living in the land for 3 years, you get it, but you have to prove that. You can't just not prove it. You can't just say it. You have to prove it. So really they match up, and with that, Hadran alach misham made. So we did 3 things today, just to very quickly summarize because it's late. We had the 5 attempts to understand what that first statement was. It was so difficult. We finally figured it out. Then we had this question, can a son inherit his mother when the son's dead? We said no. We proved it from 2 sources, and then we proved we gave the logic, and then we ended with this argument over 2 people about a sale, and then compared the machloket, Rav Nachman, to a different case, and in the end explained each of their positions. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov, good day, and may it bring B'sorot Tovot.